96% of you are not subscribed to the channel. When I reach 1,000 subscribers, I will share a series of exclusive stories. Subscribe now. It's strange how the galaxy can feel so vast and yet so small at the same time. I thought I'd felt its full range during my years as a diplomat, but walking through the Imperial Hall of Delorian Prime was another story altogether. The architecture here was staggering, a shimmering array of crystalline arches stretching upward, reflecting light from the three suns of the Delorian system. And somewhere in this resplendent maze of a palace awaited Princess Seraphine. My orders were explicit: find a way to secure peace between the Galactic Union and the Krasian Empire, or prepare for the grim alternative, war on a galactic scale. My mind was racing as I approached the main chamber, knowing well that Seraphine, heiress to the Krasian Empire and the daughter of Emperor Martek, held the key to success or failure in her hands. Her reputation was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned diplomats. They said her beauty was as sharp as her words, and her ruthlessness even sharper. Taking a deep breath, I adjusted my collar. There was no room for mistakes here. The Krasians saw humanity as little more than a young, inferior species. But here I was, humanity's appointed diplomat. We were here to try to prevent one of the most devastating wars in the history of the galaxy. And yet, with the Krasians' near unbreakable pride, success seemed more a fantasy than a real possibility. The doors to the council chamber slid open, and I caught my first glimpse of her. She stood with her back to me, framed by a wall of crystal-clear glass overlooking the imperial capital's skyline. The suns cast a soft glow on her silhouette, illuminating her gold-trimmed, elegant gown. Even before she turned to acknowledge me, I could sense an undeniable authority radiating from her. When she did look my way, her expression was unreadable, a mask perfected over years of political warfare. "You're the human diplomat, I assume," she began, her voice like ice over still water. She didn't ask. It was a statement, as though she already knew everything there was to know about me. "Yes, Princess Seraphine," I said, inclining my head respectfully. "Lucas Wright, here as a representative of the Galactic Union." She assessed me silently, her eyes unwavering, her gaze a shade colder than the ice fields of Illyrian V. I was prepared for a stare-down, but the intensity in her eyes was still staggering. Finally, she motioned for me to sit across from her at the negotiating table, a smooth yet deliberate movement that communicated control. I took my seat, feeling like I was settling in across from a tightly wound spring. "Let's make one thing clear from the beginning, Lucas Wright," she said, her tone flat. "The Krasian Empire does not bow to threats, least of all from the Galactic Union." "Of course, Princess," I replied, measuring my words carefully. "I understand your position. We're here to reach a consensus, one that respects the sovereignty and priorities of both our governments." "A convenient turn of phrase," she replied, a trace of derision in her voice. "But we both know why you're here, and it's not because your union is concerned with the welfare of the Krasian Empire. This negotiation is simply a way for you to stave off war on terms that benefit humanity." I met her gaze, unflinching. "You're right, Princess. Peace serves humanity's interests, as it does the interests of every race in the Union. But it's also something more. Peace is stability, it's prosperity. It's the chance to build rather than destroy. I imagine even the Krasian Empire, as mighty as it is, values that." Her eyes narrowed, and a chill swept through the air between us. I could feel the weight of her judgment, but I'd prepared for this. At least, I thought I had. "So you speak of lofty ideals, of building something greater," she said, an edge to her voice. "But let me ask you this, Lucas Wright. How does humanity intend to build when your own history is so riddled with war and conquest? Are we really supposed to believe that you come here as the harbingers of peace, when all evidence suggests otherwise?" Her words hit harder than I expected. I could feel the implication, the challenge in her tone, as if she were daring me to contradict her. "Perhaps humanity's history isn't pristine," I admitted, keeping my voice steady. "We've learned through hard lessons and painful mistakes, the kind that we'd never wish on another species. But those mistakes taught us something. And maybe that's exactly why we value peace now, why we're here to offer that to others." Seraphine's expression remained unchanged, her gaze intense and unyielding. The conversation continued in this vein for what felt like hours, each of us pushing, testing, searching for weak points in the other's arguments. I found myself challenged in ways I hadn't anticipated. Seraphine's approach to negotiation was unlike anything I'd encountered. She seemed to relish dissecting my every word, exposing the flaws in my reasoning with cold precision. Finally, as the sun set and the room filled with a soft glow of DeLorean's night, she leaned back, her gaze assessing. "Tell me, Lucas Wright," she said softly, "what do you, as a human, truly know of sacrifice? The Crazians have lost generations to defend what we have. Can you claim the same?" It was an accusation, yes, but there was something else there, too. A hint of vulnerability. Or perhaps a hidden sorrow. I took a breath, steadying myself before answering. "We know more than you might think, Princess. The people of Earth have sacrificed much for the survival of our species, for the security of our allies. I may not have fought in those battles myself, but I know what we've endured. And I also know that every species has suffered in its own way." Her gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, as if for the first time. She saw past the title of human diplomat and glimpsed the person beneath it. "If that is true, then perhaps there's more to humanity than I imagined," she said, her tone almost contemplative. But then the guarded expression returned, and the walls were back in place. "Though words are still just words, Lucas. Talk of peace will not change my position." "Agreed," I replied, meeting her steely gaze. "But words are the first step toward something greater. The chance to build trust, to understand each other." Silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, and I realized that, for the first time, I wasn't just speaking as a diplomat. I wanted her to understand, to truly see that humanity was capable of the ideals I spoke of. "You're kind, you're strange," she said finally, almost to herself. "Driven by emotions, by beliefs and dreams. Yet, I don't know if that makes you stronger or weaker." "I believe it makes us both, Princess," I said, a trace of a smile breaking through my formal facade. "It's our flaw and our strength. And it's what makes us resilient." Seraphine's gaze lingered on me for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, she rose from her seat and gestured for me to follow her to the grand windows. Outside, the glittering cityscape stretched out beneath the night sky, illuminated by 1,000 shimmering lights. "This is the empire I will inherit," she said, her voice softer now, almost wistful. "It's beautiful, yes. But it is also fragile. Even the strongest walls can crumble, Lucas. Even the mightiest empires can fall." Her words were tinged with a sadness I hadn't expected. She was Seraphine, the cold, unrelenting princess of Crazia, but standing here, she was also something else, a woman shouldering an unimaginable burden, the weight of an entire empire. "And is that why you're here, Princess?" I asked gently. "To protect your people, no matter the cost?" She turned to me, her gaze meeting mine, and for the briefest moment, the mask slipped. I could see something unguarded in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, of vulnerability. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the steely resolve I'd come to expect. "Yes," she said simply. "I will protect them, no matter what it takes." And yet, in that moment, I understood that there was more to her than the ruthless diplomat, the unyielding leader. She was someone who, in her own way, was as trapped as I was, bound by duty, by expectations, by the weight of her title. It was something I recognized because I, too, carried a similar weight. As the night wore on, our conversation turned softer, less guarded. We spoke not as diplomats, but as individuals. Lucas and Seraphine, two people caught in the tides of history, struggling to find common ground in a galaxy on the brink of chaos. There was something almost surreal about it, this unexpected understanding that began to bloom between us. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, she turned to me with a look that I couldn't quite read. "You may not have changed my position, Lucas," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But you've given me something to think about." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the silent, crystalline hall, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't ignore. The silence after Seraphine left lingered long after she had disappeared down the hall. The twilight over Delorian Prime deepened, painting the crystalline walls in dark hues of violet and indigo. I found myself still staring out over the sprawling city, reflecting on our conversation, on her intense gaze and the surprising softness that had briefly flickered there. I had come here expecting resistance, but now there was a glimmer, perhaps small, but real, that maybe, somehow, this fragile piece could work. A soft, rhythmic vibration rose through the floor beneath me, snapping me back to the present. It was subtle at first, but quickly intensified, turning into a low, ominous hum. The entire room trembled. My instinct kicked in as I looked up just in time to see a streak of blinding light arcing through the sky. A missile, unmistakably aimed at the heart of the Krasian Empire. The sound was deafening as the missile hit, sending a shock wave through the structure. I staggered, bracing myself against the nearest column as the palace seemed to sway around me. An alarm blared to life, piercing the air with a shrill, urgent cry. Sorry to interrupt the story, but if you haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. The doors burst open, and Seraphine rushed back into the room. Her face, usually unreadable, was marked by a fleeting expression of shock. "Lucas, stay close," she commanded, all pretense of diplomacy gone. In her place stood a leader hardened by conflict, her gaze sharp and focused. "Who's attacking?" I managed, my voice barely audible above the chaos. She didn't answer immediately, her focus shifting to the display screen that flickered to life on the far wall. I caught sight of the scene outside, ships, their insignias stark and unfamiliar, swarming the skies above Delorian Prime. Enemy fighters zigzagged across the horizon, firing relentlessly at Krasian defenses. "Not who I expected," she muttered, her voice a mix of frustration and disbelief. "It's the Corellian insurgents. They must have found a way past our planetary shields." Another missile struck, closer this time, sending shrapnel scattering across the room. Seraphine ducked instinctively, pulling me down with her. I could feel her grip tighten around my wrist, surprising me with its strength. The sound of distant screams and the staccato burst of laser fire filled the air, mingling with a thick, acrid smoke that now clouded the room. "Come on," she hissed, her voice urgent. "We have to get to the lower levels. They'll be safer." I followed her through a maze of corridors, each corner bringing new glimpses of the chaos that had overtaken the palace. Guards and staff scrambled past us, some carrying wounded comrades, others shouting orders or trying to douse the flames that had started licking up the walls. We reached a reinforced corridor leading down into the palace's fortified bunker. Even as the ground continued to shake, Seraphine moved with a calculated precision, her demeanor as unyielding as ever. As we descended, I struggled to keep pace with her. "Why would the Corellians attack here?" I asked, breathless. "Why else?" she replied, not sparing me a glance. "They see the Krasian Empire as a symbol of oppression. For them, Delorian Prime is the ultimate target." As we rounded the corner, a group of Krasian guards met us, faces taut with worry. Seraphine issued a string of sharp commands in Krasian, her voice unwavering, though I could feel the tension in her words. The guards nodded, saluting her before splitting up and heading toward defensive positions along the corridor. The fortress-like structure of the lower levels provided some reprieve from the intensity above, but it was clear that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Explosions continued to shake the ground, echoing through the walls like the drumbeats of some ominous, unseen force closing in. The insurgents were relentless, their attack clearly calculated to cause maximum damage. One of the guards returned with a tactical display unit, projecting a live feed of the battlefield. The enemy ships were closing in, concentrating their fire on the palace's primary defenses. The Krasian soldiers were holding their own, but the insurgents' numbers seemed overwhelming. "We're not going to hold them off like this," I said, realizing the grim truth as I took in the feed. Seraphine glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Are you suggesting a strategy, Lucas?" "Actually, yes," I replied, forcing a confidence into my tone that I wasn't entirely sure I felt. "If we can reroute power from the auxiliary generator, we might be able to reinforce the shields on the lower levels. That would buy us some time." She raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing. For a moment, I thought she might brush off the suggestion, but then she turned to the guard, issuing a rapid string of orders. Within moments, the guard had dispatched a team to the generator room. "If this buys us any time," she said, her gaze turning back to me, "you'll have proven more useful than I anticipated." I gave her a quick nod, feeling the weight of our precarious alliance. As the guards worked on the shields, Seraphine turned to face me, her voice low and urgent. "Lucas, you should understand something," she said, glancing toward the display. "If these insurgents break through, they won't differentiate between Crazian or human. As far as they're concerned, you're just another enemy of their cause." "I figured as much," I replied, meeting her gaze. "But I'm not about to abandon you here." She seemed taken aback, if only for a moment, before a strange, conflicted expression settled in her eyes. "Your loyalty is surprising." Just as the shields began to fortify, another explosion rocked the room, and the lights flickered. One of the guards reported that several entry points had been breached. The insurgents were pushing deeper into the palace, their intent unmistakable. "Then we fight," she said, her voice like steel. She reached for a weapon from one of the guards, turning to face me as she handed it over. "Can you handle yourself in a firefight?" I took the weapon, gripping it with a steady hand. "I've handled worse," I replied, hoping my confidence sounded convincing. The truth was, I'd never been in a situation like this. Diplomatic conflicts and high-stakes negotiations, yes, but hand-to-hand combat, especially against insurgents, was new territory. But now wasn't the time for doubt. I followed Seraphine as we moved down the narrow corridor toward the main entry point, the sounds of blaster fire growing louder as we approached. The Corellian forces had managed to infiltrate the palace's lower levels, their dark uniforms contrasting with the sleek, polished surfaces of the Crazian halls. The first insurgent came into view, his weapon raised, eyes wild. I aimed and fired instinctively, the recoil of the blaster jolting through my arms. The shot hit its mark, and the insurgent crumpled to the floor. Seraphine didn't pause, moving swiftly and decisively, her weapon discharging with a practiced precision. One by one, we pushed the insurgents back, but the fight was relentless. As we pressed forward, side by side, I could feel an odd, unspoken understanding developing between us. Her movements were fluid, calculated. She had done this countless times before. And despite my inexperience, I found myself adapting to her rhythm, mirroring her movements as best as I could. "On your left," she called out, and I turned just in time to catch an approaching insurgent, his blaster aimed directly at us. I pulled the trigger, the blast hitting him squarely in the chest. Seraphine gave a curt nod of approval, her gaze never leaving the hallway in front of us. "Keep moving. We can't let them gain any more ground." We fought together, an unlikely alliance forged in the chaos of the attack. The heat of battle blurred the lines between Crazian and human, diplomat and warrior. All that mattered was survival, the instinctive drive to protect what we each held dear, she, her empire, and I, a fragile hope for peace. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the onslaught began to thin. The insurgents, sensing the fortified defenses and the strength of the resistance, started to retreat. The remaining Crazian guards pursued them, securing the breached corridors and fortifying the palace perimeter. Breathing heavily, I leaned against the wall, catching my breath. Seraphine stood beside me, her gaze focused on the smoldering ruins of the hall. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked worn, vulnerable, even. She glanced at me, the tension slowly draining from her expression. "You're not half bad, Lucas," she said quietly, a faint, almost reluctant smile playing on her lips. "Coming from you, Princess, I'll take that as a compliment," I replied, offering a tired smile of my own. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. The alliance we'd forged, born out of necessity and forged in the fires of battle, had shifted something between us. For the first time, I sensed that Seraphine no longer saw me as just an outsider, a human diplomat on Crazian soil. For a brief, fleeting moment, I was something more. And perhaps so was she. The dust had barely settled after the Corellian attack on Delorian Prime. The palace halls bore marks of battle, cracks in the crystalline walls, scorched patches from the blaster fire. It felt surreal, standing in these halls now in the calm after the storm, but the day's agenda was as pressing as ever. The Galactic Peace Summit, organized with painstaking effort, was still set to proceed. And despite the tension hanging in the air, Seraphine and I both knew that this meeting couldn't wait. The towering double doors to the Grand Council chamber loomed ahead, gleaming with an almost intimidating brilliance in the morning light. It felt oddly symbolic. 2 doors, solid and daunting, each leading into a place where every word could tip the balance of peace in the galaxy. Seraphine's gaze was fixed on the doors as if they held the weight of her entire world. "Ready?" I asked, catching her attention. "Sorry to interrupt the story, but if you haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to subscribe to the channel." She turned to me, her expression as hard as the marble beneath our feet, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. "I've attended summits before, Lucas," she replied, almost reflexively. But her voice softened as she added, "But not like this." I nodded, understanding the weight she carried. The Corellian attack had intensified the already fragile political tension, and for once, Seraphine and I found ourselves on the same side. Our task was to convince leaders across the galaxy that peace was still possible, even in the face of these latest hostilities. As we stepped through the doors, I took in the sight of the leaders seated around the vast council table, each one representing an alliance or faction with its own values and vested interests. From the crimson robes of the Pyrian delegations to the regal blues of the Vantari Council, every figure here carried a history of pride, conflict, and unspoken grudges. Seraphine walked with practiced poise to the front of the room, her presence alone enough to command attention. She glanced at me, an unspoken invitation to stand beside her. Together, we would lead these discussions. "Esteemed representatives of the galaxy," she began, her voice strong yet measured, "I thank you for your resilience in coming here today. In the wake of yesterday's events, we must remember that our unity and our survival depend on this alliance. If we fail to stand together now, we risk tearing ourselves apart." Her words hung in the air, striking chords with every delegate seated at the table. But tension sparked from several directions, wary glances cast toward her. The Pyrian envoy, a stocky figure with intense amber eyes, leaned forward. "What assurance do we have that Del Orion Prime is a secure location for our meetings? Yesterday's attack was a breach unlike anything in recent history, and it does not speak well of the Krasian Empire's defense systems." Seraphine's gaze remained steely. "The attack was indeed a rare breach, but we acted swiftly to neutralize the threat, as you all witnessed. Reinforcements are now in place, and Del Orion Prime is fortified. The safety of all is our utmost priority." I stepped in, adding, "And we must remember, the attack underscores exactly why we're here today. We're not here to question our security arrangements, but to discuss how we can ensure peace across our territories." Yesterday's incident was a reminder of the stakes at hand. The room fell silent for a moment. I caught a few council members exchanging glances, each measuring the response. But the Vantari ambassador, a reserved, sharp-eyed woman named Elira, spoke up, her tone calm yet probing. "Lucas is correct. Yet it begs the question, is this summit just a symbolic gesture? We've been here before, at different times in history, and unity has always eluded us. How do you plan to address the underlying grievances and distrust, Princess Seraphine?" Seraphine's jaw tightened. It was no secret that many here harbored lingering resentment against the Krasian Empire. But rather than deflect, she surprised me by answering with a rare honesty. "The Krasian Empire has not been blameless in the past," she admitted, her voice unwavering. "But if we are to survive, we must look forward. Holding on to old wounds will only ensure new conflicts. And for that reason, I am prepared to make concessions." A murmur rippled through the room. I saw surprise flash in the eyes of several council members, a reaction Seraphine surely noted. She cast a glance at me, a flicker of something vulnerable in her expression, a hint that this wasn't easy for her. The Vantari ambassador raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Concessions? The Krasian Empire has rarely entertained such a notion." Seraphine hesitated, and I knew she was choosing her words carefully. "I'm willing to open dialogue regarding the Empire's governance of disputed territories and potentially establish autonomous regions. This can begin as soon as we all agree on a unified framework." Elira's gaze softened slightly, the steel in her eyes tempered by a glimmer of newfound respect. "If these words are genuine, Princess, then perhaps you're right. Perhaps we can reach an understanding." I watched Seraphine as she held the room's attention, noting the subtle shift in her demeanor. There was strength in her voice, but beneath it lay a vulnerability she rarely revealed. She was giving these leaders a glimpse into her true intentions, and it was affecting them. The session continued with tense but productive exchanges, and as the hours wore on, the delegates began to consider the possibilities Seraphine had laid out. I could see that her candor had opened a door, however narrow, to trust. When the talks finally recessed, the delegates retreated to private quarters to reflect. Seraphine and I found ourselves alone, standing in the now empty chamber. The weight of what we'd accomplished, and what still lay ahead, hung heavily in the air. "Do you really believe we can pull this off?" I asked, my voice low. Her gaze drifted toward the table, where just moments before, opposing leaders had finally considered her words. "I want to believe it," she murmured, her tone softer, almost vulnerable. I stepped closer, my gaze fixed on her. "You took a big risk in there. I can't imagine that was easy." She looked up at me, a ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It wasn't. But I had no other choice. And you were right. We need allies, and sometimes that means showing them something beyond a hardened exterior." I returned her faint smile. "I knew there was more to you than iron and strategy, Seraphine." She laughed softly, a sound so rare that it almost caught me off guard. "Only you would dare to say that, Lucas." As the silence settled between us, I felt the intensity of the moment. After everything we had been through, the attack, the shared fight for survival, the hours spent in the council chamber trying to forge peace, there was an undeniable closeness between us, something that went beyond diplomacy. Her eyes lingered on mine, a glimmer of something vulnerable yet resolute there. For the first time, the walls she kept so carefully constructed were down, if only for a moment. "If we make it through this summit and bring peace to the galaxy," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper, "what will you do then?" I hadn't thought that far ahead, but her question made me pause. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Maybe I'll stay a little longer on Delorian Prime. See what else this place has to offer." She didn't respond, but the faintest blush touched her cheeks, a sign of emotion she rarely displayed. And in that moment, with the remnants of the day's conflict and the promise of a fragile peace surrounding us, I realized that something had shifted between us. The following days at the summit were tense yet productive, as leaders across the galaxy deliberated on every detail of our peace plan. Each compromise required tact and persistence, and though there were heated exchanges, Seraphine and I found ourselves working seamlessly together. We had become a team, each of us playing off the other's strengths, filling in the gaps where needed. As we passed the final evening before the signing ceremony, the weight of accomplishment mingled with an unmistakable sense of relief. That night, I found Seraphine standing alone on the palace balcony, overlooking the spires and domes of Delorian Prime under the stars. I joined her quietly, taking in the serenity of the view that seemed almost surreal after so many days of tension and negotiations. "It's done," I said, the words coming out with a mix of pride and exhaustion. "The treaty will be signed tomorrow." She nodded, her gaze still fixed on the skyline. "Yes, we made it happen." There was a satisfaction in her voice, but also a hint of something deeper, an emotion that felt both foreign and vulnerable. "Peace," I said, tasting the word. "After all this time, after all these battles, it almost doesn't feel real." "It's real," she replied, turning to face me. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I could see past the armor she wore so carefully. I could see the weight she carried for her people, the burdens she'd shouldered alone. And I could see something else, something she'd never let me see before. "Lucas," she began, then hesitated. I waited, feeling my heart pound with an intensity one couldn't ignore. "When this is over, I don't want you to leave. You don't have to stay, I know, but if you're willing." She let the sentence hang, her gaze unwavering yet vulnerable in a way that made the air between us electric. I stepped closer, closing the gap between us, and without thinking, I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," I said softly, barely daring to breathe. In that quiet moment, we let down our guards entirely, no longer the diplomat and the princess, no longer on opposing sides. We were simply two people who had fought, survived, and ultimately, found each other. The next morning, the signing ceremony proceeded with all the grandeur befitting such a historic event. Leaders signed the treaty, and after months of conflict and turmoil, the galaxy had, at last, an agreement that promised peace. Seraphine and I stood side by side as the witnesses to it all, our gazes meeting once or twice across the room with an unspoken understanding. As the ceremony concluded and the council hall erupted in applause, I felt a calm satisfaction settle over me. This wasn't just a victory for the galaxy. It was a moment of clarity, of knowing that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Afterward, as the delegates began to depart, Seraphine found me once more. She smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "Thank you, Lucas. I don't think we'd have made it here without you." "It was a team effort," I replied, returning her smile. "And you know, I'm not going anywhere. We've got a lot of work ahead of us if we're going to keep this peace." She nodded, and for the first time, I saw hope in her eyes, a hope that went beyond mere duty. And as we left the council chamber together, I knew that this was only the beginning. We had a galaxy to rebuild, and perhaps a future to build as well, side by side. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this story, please like it and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.